Inside the stories that affect you. This is Inside KELOLAND.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us today. In late May, the death of George Floyd, a black man who died under the knee of a white police officer in Minneapolis, sparked outrage around the world. Since then, KELOLAND News has continued the conversation on race relations. Now, one demographic that's also long dealt with discrimination are Native Americans. Joining us tonight via Zoom to talk about the ongoing issues are Columbia graduate student Sydney Shad, Dakini School Principal Jennifer Bauman, and Whitney Rencounter with the South Dakota Humanities Council Chairman. Thank you all for joining us today.
For having us.
Yeah, so we're going to start today with one issue that of late has been a lot talking about, of course, is the handling of the coronavirus, namely efforts to prevent an outbreak on a reservation. What's your take on some of the pushback? Whitney, we'll start with you.
Well, I think it's there's no secret in America. We're really not taught about the history of our country and K through 12 education. Most Americans, we don't get to decide what we learn. And so I think a lot of times when some of the injustices and the lack of education is uncovered, it leads to some pushback. It leads to, kind of some self-empowerment from some of the indigenous peoples, the African-American peoples, I guess you can say, across this nation that have had a tough history in our country. And I think a lot of times when you talk about some of the history, ultimately, we have to learn, and we do better when we know better. So education is the key. And I really think that this is a turning point in our country. So it's time for us to continue to educate one another and work together, see what we can do to help make our communities a better place for our children.
Good. Jennifer, we'll go to you next. Anything you want to say about some of the pushback in the state for what some of the tribes have done to prevent the spread of coronavirus in the reservations in the state?
You know, the solution that our tribes have set up for us is to really keep us healthy and try to avoid a major outbreak in our small communities that we have, in our reservations. One of the things that we face is lack of health care. And I know that that's one thing that our tribal chairmen have really tried to make sure that we are being aware of that, like Whitney was saying, and making sure that we are educated about the coronavirus. And, as far as pushbacks go, one thing that I guess that I was really taken aback by was the lawsuit that was threatened amongst the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe and the Pine Ridge Sioux tribe from the state of South Dakota. And the tribal relations that were supposed to be improving doesn't seem to have improved based upon what we're looking at.
Good. Sydney, we'll go to you. Anything that you want to add about some of the efforts that the tribes in South Dakota have had for coronavirus and the reaction from state officials?
Well, I think just reservation residents, it's really turned into an us versus them when all preventative measures are for everyone, whether you're enrolled or not. And it shouldn't be an us versus them situation, but people see it as an attack on their rights, and it's not.
Yeah. Well, now let's talk about just the general health care for Native Americans and access to health care on some of those rural reservations in South Dakota. What do you think about the health care that is provided and available right now, and what changes do you think need to happen? Whitney, we'll go back to you.
Yeah, I think historically in our country, our ancestors, they lived a certain way. There wasn't a lot of diseases. There wasn't a lot of spread of diseases until the smallpox epidemic and other things like that. So historically, our ancestors were able to live generally a healthy life, eating healthy, taking care of themselves. But when they were put on reservations, one of the agreements for leasing the land, the United States government promised to provide health care. But I think historically, we always say it's been underfunded, it's been lackluster, but that's been an agreement that's been put in place. And I think ultimately, in order to get to a better place in this world, we need to work together. I think we really need to have, it goes back to education. We need to understand how the health issues affect our peoples and our communities. And it's up to us to continue to find solutions to be able to better the epidemics and the pandemic that we're facing today. It's important for us to have a little better understanding. Once again, when we know how it's impacting our relatives on the community, a lot of our elderly really have a tough time with what's happening today. And so we want to continue on and try to educate and bring forth some more solutions for our elders, especially.
Jennifer, let's go to you now. Anything that you want to add about the conversation of healthcare on our reservations and for Native American people here in South Dakota?
Sure, healthcare is definitely a challenge for people living in rural areas. Although during this crisis and this coronavirus outbreak, I'm, as a firsthand witness watching our hospital, and our healthcare system in our community, I was really pleased to see that they seem to be responding fairly quick, and they're getting people the appropriate care that they need. Currently, our hospital here in our little community at Eagle Butte, South Dakota, has 8 beds with 2 beds that are open right now. But, like I said, the facility and the tribal chairman and his department and the tribal healthcare department seem to be working pretty closely together to ensure that our healthcare needs are being met at this time to try to avoid any further outbreak in our community.
Good. All right. And Sydney, anything you'd like to add about the healthcare conversation?
Yeah, so healthcare in a rural area is, it's really difficult because we're forced to anticipate illness. It's not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when. Incarceration, food security, and accessibility, housing, transportation, all impact our physical, mental, and spiritual health. And until we address those, we're going to be stuck in this generational cycle of poor health outcomes.
Very good. Interesting conversation already. We're going to take a quick break now, but stay with us inside KELOLAND. We'll be right back as we continue the conversation. Welcome back to Inside KELOLAND. Tonight we are talking race relations via Zoom with leaders in the Native American community. Thanks again to all of you for joining us. Changing topics now. Back in early July, President Trump made a special visit to Mount Rushmore. And that day, dozens of protesters blocked a road near Keystone. Can you tell us a little bit more about the message those protesters were trying to convey? Jennifer, we'll start with you.
Well, our protesters have a voice, and they have a strong voice. And when you live in a community like ours, our voice is one of the things that we have, and it's usually it comes out pretty strong. And during that time, they want to be heard, and they want to make changes that are positive for our people. Chairman Fraser stated, "Nothing stands greater than a reminder to the great Sioux Nation of a country that cannot keep a promise of treaty than the faces carved into our sacred land on what the United States calls Mount Rushmore. We're now forced to witness the lashing of our land with arrogance and fire, hoping our land survive." And the Oglala president called Mount Rushmore a great sign of disrespect. And so, when it comes to the Native American lands, those really are sacred to us as a people. And, I'm sure you guys are well aware that there's a long-standing litigation that's going on with those lands still today.
Good. Sydney, add your thoughts on the protests and kind of the message that a lot of the people there were trying to convey.
Yeah, easy. Land back, and not the colonial construct of land ownership, but stewardship and how we care for the land.
Good. And Whitney, your thoughts as well?
Well, it was back in 1851 that the Fort Laramie Treaty was signed between the United States government and the ancestors of our people in the Northern Plains tribes. And then 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty was reduced to just half of pretty much South Dakota, but it still protected and preserved the Black Hills. And then around 1872 is when General George Armstrong Custer came to the Black Hills, found gold. The gold rush began. That passed the Black Hills Act, which eventually led to the Sell or Starve Act, in which our ancestors were told to sell the Black Hills or in the land or starve. And I think so historically, there's been a lot of the relationship between many of the presidents. For example, Abraham Lincoln, responsible for Dakota 38+2, the largest mass hanging in our country's history. And so there's a lot of perspectives when it comes to in America for a lot of different reasons. There's good and bad in every race, good and bad in every culture. I think ultimately what it really truly comes down to is we have to sit down and learn about one another. We need to really teach about the history in our educational system, so we all know, so we all understand. So when these things happen, we're better prepared to work through and maybe come up with better solutions.
Well, talking about protests going on in other parts of the country, we've seen statues being removed all over America right now. Are there changes that need to be made here in South Dakota? Sydney, let's start with you.
I think we need to put more of a focus on like Crazy Horse. Let's complete Crazy Horse. Let's, highlight leaders that were already here in South Dakota. The Walk of Presidents downtown Rapid City really doesn't make sense to me because none of them are from here.
Yeah, Jennifer, how about your thoughts?
Sure, and I'll continue to quote Mr. Chairman Fraser and President Bear Runner, because I really do honor their positions that they are in as our tribal leaders in our tribal government. But, they encourage Mount Rushmore to be removed. One of my history professors once told me that the Constitution was created not because all men were equal or to ensure dignity or liberty, but because they wanted to protect what was theirs. They didn't want anyone taking their stuff or material items. Whether that's true or not, that's up to the person who's reading and interpreting the Constitution. But I really do honor what our tribal government is trying to do for us, and so I will continue to support our chairmen and our tribal leaders.
And Whitney, your thoughts on monuments here in South Dakota?
Well, I think one monument that I think our people appreciate is the Dignity Monument that's over there by the Minichaussee, by Missouri River in Chamberlain, South Dakota, right by my reservation, the Crow Creek Sioux Tribe. And so nonetheless, that's an example of what we can do if we can learn about one another. And I think in South Dakota, the state education committee had an opportunity to pass Indian education for all, and I think we really missed an opportunity there when that was denied. We have the Oceti-Sakowin Central Understanding curriculum, but I really think it just truly comes down to we have to educate everyone in South Dakota so we have a better understanding of one another. Because when we're stuck to figure this all out, it leads to confrontations. It leads to kind of a sense of how do we build, how do we grow, how do we work together. Without guidance of that, and us leaders and many leaders across our state working together to listen and to honor one another in that way, we're going to have to deal with a lot of this into the future.
Some important discussions, and we're going to talk more about education in just a moment. Don't go away. We'll continue the conversation when Inside KELOLAND returns. Welcome back to Inside KELOLAND. We are continuing our conversation on race relations via Zoom with leaders in the Native American community. So as we talk about education, we want to know, are there differences in education for the Native American population in South Dakota, from finding representation in teachers in schools to going on to higher education? What do you see as far as Native Americans' experiences here in South Dakota? And Jennifer, let's start with you.
There is definitely a disparity amongst the educational opportunities for our Native American students. Oftentimes, if we're going to make it in college or seek higher education, it's because we come from supportive homes or we have an internal desire to break the cycle. When we find teachers that come to our communities, more often or not, they mold to the teaching styles that we need for our students. And, I want people to remember, just because our students are quiet doesn't mean they don't understand. Perhaps they come from a family that doesn't use a lot of words to communicate. That's one of the things that I see a lot in our educational systems, is that because they're quiet, there must be something wrong. Oftentimes there's not. We have a highly intelligent group of people. We talk about that generational trauma and how that's impacted, and I think that's one of the pieces that's been left behind as an impact from that generational trauma that their elders have experienced prior to them. But the disparity amongst the educational system really does exist, and we're trying to correct that as we go along and make those changes so we can have better opportunities for our students.
Sydney, your thoughts and your experiences when it comes to education in South Dakota?
Yeah, so I did my undergrad here in South Dakota, and being a student in higher ed, you're not just a student, you're educating your professors and your peers on Native issues. You're organizing on campus, you're hosting these cultural events on campus, you're holding university administration accountable. You're the poster children when they need advertisements. You're doing so much without extra incentives or like anything. You're taking on so much more along with being a student, along with working a full-time job. And it is a different experience than our counterparts.
Whitney, we'll end with you too here on the education topic. Anything you want to add about experiences Native Americans in South Dakota experience with education?
Yeah, well, I really think that because we have a long way to go to really make our facilities and our educational system inclusive, to really include the perspective of Indigenous people. I think until that comes, we're going to have to deal with a lot of the challenges that come with that. One of the things that a lot of schools can do, however, is take the time, be proactive in teaching about Native education, including that in your classrooms, because that's really what's going to help make our state a better place in terms of being inclusive, having better understanding. And we provide that in Rapid City here. We have a program that I've been involved with for the last 11 years. It's been in the school system for 26 years. It's called the Ateapi Youth Mentoring Program. And we have mentors that go into the school that provide the support to our teachers. And we work with Native and non-Native students to promote and help them to learn about our culture. And that really makes a big difference because you have students feeling a little more comfortable about themselves. For the last, 7 years or so, 90+% of our students that have participated in our program because of the support we provide graduate high school, and so we've really helped the work with the school district in Rapid City. I really think that's just a small example of what can be done across our state in providing education and support for Indigenous students and teachers and families, because that's really what's going to make the change in having more teachers in our school systems and as well the perspective as well. So, we have a long way to go, but I think it's possible. We have to work together.
Good. Well, when it comes to child services in South Dakota, what are some specific challenges that Native Americans can run into? Sydney, let's start with you.
I don't necessarily feel comfortable speaking on that. I don't have any children, and I'm also not active in that.
Yeah. Jennifer, we'll go on to you. I'm sure it's something you've dealt with in the school district.
Sure. In my career, I've run into situations as a mandated reporter who, is obligated to report certain situations that are happening to our students in their home lives. And, oftentimes it comes back as unsubstantiated, and there really isn't anything that's done for the child. I did have a report come back to me one time that told me they had dry macaroni, they'll be okay. Those kind of things, and really making sure that we find a system that can support our students who are brave enough. And that really is what it boils down to. They're being brave enough to tell somebody that they trusted something that's going on in their home, and they were looking for support and help. And when we are trying to provide that support and help, it would be beneficial if all agencies and entities could align so that we could provide what we need to for students, so that we can, again, start giving them those positive experiences so that they know that there's support that exists. And that might change, that might change one of their lives. We don't know that.
Yeah, Whitney, anything to add about child services for Native American children in South Dakota?
Yeah, it's so important. I think we talk about ICWA, we talk about some of the things historically that have happened in our state when Indigenous students are taken from their family and maybe they're put in a non-Native home. A lot of times, there's a lot of times the culture is gone, and access and learning. And because a student, in order to really feel good about themselves, they have to understand and believe that their being and who they are is not wrong. Just because they're different than the dominant culture doesn't mean they should feel bad. So I think ultimately educating all the social service workers, all the folks that are involved with Native American students and families, we really have to provide more of a relationship and training and helping them to have better understanding about our culture and how we operate. Because historically in our country, Native American culture was deemed wrong and evil and bad. But we're learning today that, in 1978, when the American Indian Religious Freedoms Act was passed finally, that we're learning that self-determination, that when we're allowed to just kind of live our lives and be happy in our own skin, I think that really truly makes a difference for our students. And so providing healthcare and education and especially services for our students and our younger children is so important and vital, because Head Start is so important in the future success of our students. So we really need to include and provide better education and support for all the staff that work with our Native American students.
Well, we are going to take another quick break. Stay with us inside KELOLAND. We'll be right back. Welcome back. It is a big election year, and we want to know if there's challenges in voter registration and actually casting ballots for Native Americans in South Dakota. Is there easy access to the polls on Election Day? Sydney, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I've had the privilege of being able to cast my vote via mail-in every election. But I think it's important to highlight that, not just voting in the national election, but tribal elections, state elections, that's really what's impacting our people day to day.
Jennifer, let's go to you. What do you see in Eagle Butte?
I see a lot of organization, and we do have easy access to polls. I don't know what that's going to look like this year with the coronavirus outbreak, but typically we do have easy access.
Good. And Whitney, let's get your thoughts too on elections for Native Americans here in South Dakota.
Well, I think my thoughts are that it seems like around election time, most of the folks vying for the seat that they're running for, they tend to have a more of a eagerness to know and to look into and to listen to Indigenous people. And then when they get voted in, that kind of goes to the wayside. I think we have to understand that to be authentic, our elected officials, it's a time that it feels like Indigenous peoples have a voice, because many of the elected officials are seeking that voice. But I think that has to be something, in order for things to get better, it has to be an everyday practice. And I think one of the things that we notice with the elections is sometimes on reservations, if you have a P.O. box, most of our Indigenous peoples don't have a street address. I grew up without a street address, so all we had was a P.O. box. And I think sometimes that was misused as a tactic, that if you don't have a valid street address, you can't vote. And I think that was something that they ran into in North Dakota. So we just want to continue to open those barriers and not utilize, because it's our lives that are at stake here, and our students. So I think it's just we have to continue to work together and every day practice a willingness to learn and work with our people.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your stories today and for your time. We very much appreciate continuing the conversation here on KELOLAND. And you can find out more about today's topics online at KELOLAND.com. Just click on the Inside KELOLAND section, and then join us every Sunday following the 10 o'clock news right here on KELO TV. That's all the time we have for today. Be sure to join us again next week for more on what's going on inside KELOLAND.